Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on the behavior of firms. This week we're going to be examining the way that firms think about costs. I'm Mike Lenz and I'll be guiding you through the slides. Firms, remember, combine inputs to produce goods and services. They represent the supply side of the supply and demand model. And they pay wages to workers and pay rents to capital inputs as part of their production process. The production function, we learned, gives us the relationship between the amount of inputs we use, that is, how much capital and how much labor, and the amount of output that can be produced given the resources we put into production. The cost function tells us the relationship between the amount of output that we produce and the cost of producing that output, which depends on the prices that are charged by workers and the costs, the rental rates associated with using capital. So if we want to figure out what our cost function looks like, what we want to do is we take the amount of output we want to produce. We examine what's the least cost way to produce it given the various combinations of inputs that we could use, the amounts of labor and capital. And we look at the price of those different inputs, and this tells us what our costs will be given the amount of output that we want to produce. So we combine the price of inputs with our production technology to translate production into costs. Now, one way to think about costs is to split them into fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs are the ones that don't vary with the amount of output. So if I have an office building, the rent I pay on my office space doesn't vary regardless of how much output I produce. The rent is some fixed amount, and it doesn't vary depending on how much output I produce. Variable costs, on the other hand, depend on the level of output. So if I'm making hamburgers, the raw materials I use are going to depend on how many hamburgers I want to produce. Employees are usually thought of as a variable cost in the short run. It's easy to vary the amount of workers I bring in to make hamburgers. I can increase or decrease the amount of employees I have working, and the amount of output that they produce will depend on the amount of workers that I bring in. So those are variable costs. Total costs include both variable and fixed costs. So the total cost of production includes the variable piece and the fixed piece. And we remember the definition in economics of the short run versus the long run. In the short run, we have some inputs that are fixed in supply. And in the long run, we can vary all of our inputs. So if we think about it from the perspective of a McDonald's, McDonald's in the short run has a fixed number of stores that they can work in, and a store manager can vary the number of workers they bring to work, but they can't vary the size of the store or the number of stores that they're working out of in the short run. In the long run, McDonald's can, of course, adjust the number of workers that they bring in and the number of store locations that they have. So in the long run, all costs are variable. You can adjust the level both of labor and capital. It's often useful to think about costs on a per unit basis, to think about what does it cost on average to make a particular unit of output, or what does it cost at the margin to make an additional unit of output. And so essentially breaking our cost discussion down into an item level or an individual item level analysis is important and useful. What we want to do sometimes is compare our per unit cost to price, for instance, to measure profits. Or we want to compare the cost of a marginal unit to the price we can sell it for to measure whether we should increase or decrease production. So a couple of basic formulas. The first one is average total cost includes the total cost of production divided by the quantity produced. And we can split this again into its pieces, where the average total cost is equal to the average variable cost, or total variable cost, divided by quantity, plus the average fixed cost, or total fixed cost, divided by quantity. The marginal cost is represented by the change in cost divided by the change in quantity. So how much does it cost us to produce one more unit? That is marginal cost.